At that point, I was like, holy smokes. Extraordinary business value.
Great, Vaskin. This is live, and this is AIMUG Builders episode 6. We're filming this Christmas Eve. Merry Christmas to everyone in the audience who celebrates. And yeah, let's get started. We met at the AIMUG Builders Club. You were very friendly. We met very early on, and I wanted to know more about you. So, where are you from originally? Are you an Austinite, or did you come here
I was
a while
from
ago?
Beirut, Lebanon, originally, Armenian ethnically. But I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee for most of my formative years, I guess, and then DC and then Austin. That's how I landed here.
Uh, wow. Yeah, I think nobody's
It's quite a
originally
journey.
from Austin. Yeah, I think I haven't heard Lebanon yet, but no, I'm from Philadelphia. I think most people who are in Austin aren't from Austin originally.
Attracted
So
me because it was a tech hub. So I ended up here for this reason, to be around AI, and not just AI at the time, but now it's a good place to be.
yeah, I think actually they're calling this place Silicon Ranch. And then I told somebody I was moving over to Austin to get into tech, and he was like, oh, he's more like Silicon Valley Ranch, sort of like the dressing. So there, but I wanted to know, so how did you get into AI Mug Builders or
So
the
it
Mug
was
meetup?
It was through the meetup.com, basically. I had started my own meetup when Gen AI was coming out. Like MidJourney was my catalyst, I guess. I started playing with it and I was like, okay, that's interesting. I'd understood compression as a computer scientist, but hadn't seen models generating new things. And as soon as I learned that I could do that on my own computer, I went out and bought a laptop and started generating images with Stable Diffusion. This is November 22.
Hmm.
And so from that moment forward, I've been digging into AI. So I started a meetup right after that period to try to gather other people to gather a community. And then hosting them was just a lot of work. So I ran into Colin's group, Boston LangChain community, and they're open to LangChain and other things. And I was like, I'm into a lot of other things. So, but they're into learning together, and I want to see what this is about. So that's how I landed there. And I've been part of the Discord community quite a bit there, and I've learned a lot from other members.
Okay, so you originally came into this through diffusion models. You were really into generating images. Like, what were you doing beforehand, and like, what attracted you to these image generation models?
I was building e-commerce sites. For most of my career, I've built high availability e-commerce sites for retailers going all the way back to the late 90s. Dick's Sporting Goods was one of the sites that I helped launch way back when in the early .com era. Most of my career was built around systems integrations, e-commerce, users, a lot of personalization as well. So in that, I was always curious about new technology and what the state of the art was. Things have gotten boring until Gen AI. I mean, as a computer scientist, you don't see new things happening in your field that blow your mind very often. And being in it for 30 years, in November 22, there's something about that MidJourney experience and being able to generate my own images on my own GPU was enlightening. Had a big journey since then. There's a lot of concerns about hallucination and all sorts of things that are going on right now. I'm sure we'll talk about more, but just the fascination around the how these things could mimic neural networks. I had actually built a neural network as part of an object-oriented programming class taught by a graph theorist. So I got introduced to neural networks very early on. I understood it was just basically a modeling of the brain. So that has been something that's been of interest to me for quite a long time. I minored in psychology because of it. When AI came around, it was like my minor and my interest in psychology was married to my computer science at that time, almost boredom, right? Everything was just, I could build pretty much what I needed whenever I needed, and there wasn't any magic. And something about AI has led me to try to discover new use cases that we haven't even thought about that we can now attack with these tools. They're not perfect, they're not always right, they're not 100%, but if you take those givens I think there is some amazing stuff that can be built still, even if the models don't get any better than they are right now.
Yeah, definitely. I really want to pick your brain. So there's a couple things you just said that immediately remind me how fortunate we are to be in an actual AI summer.
Yeah.
AI is not new. It's been happening in the computer
50
science
years old.
space for a long time. Yeah, I mean, neural
Still.
networks, I think they originated as hardware in the 50s, and they were actually hard-coded um, physical neural networks. And so it's only been recently that we've had the compute available to actually implement them at scale and do all sorts of things with these algorithms that we've had for a very long time. Um, the sort of more advanced structures have only been available because we've been able to play around with them. But the concept of a perceptron is very old. And it's interesting that you learned this from a graph theorist because that's currently what I'm doing. I'm doing graph analytics and doing graph retrieval augmented generation, which is hot right now for the AI space to add context and do context engineering for LLMs and agents. Now, when you said psychology,
It's a big passion of
uh,
mine is context
that
engineering.
yeah,
Got a long
here's
thread
something
on that.
I wanted to pick your brain. So Google, I remember they released a paper. They had married a tokenized vision model to that of a language model. And I think they embodied this in a robot. And they gave it some basic robotics tasks. And they found out that the language model improved its spatial reasoning, and the spatial reasoning improved the language comprehension.
For sure. Yeah, it's still a big space of gaps and entropy. Like there's quite a lot of learnings across the modalities in these models. That language is not the only thing. That's I was like I said, I was interested in the image diffusion models at first. Now we're actually seeing diffusion models that can generate language as well. The cognitive architectures and the machine learning explosion that has gone on in the last 3 years is still evolving. I watch it very carefully for the reason of like some of these things are being done in small language models that then get adopted into the bigger models. Once you see it working in the small language model, though, you can kind of extrapolate how that will work when a larger language model gets the larger domain of knowledge, regardless of whether it's in different modalities or just different domains. I think the runway of different types of cognitive architectures, training data that can lead to use cases that can be solved is still greenfield.
But right now, we're trying to sort of guide those architectures. For example, I mean, the name of the game for AIMUG group here in Austin is LangChain and LangGraph. So how did you get from diffusion models into agents and orchestration?
Well, the diffusion models kind of gave me the inspiration of the diffusion models came out first. They were more for a consumer that wasn't paying attention to AI, that wasn't deep into AI already. It's the first thing that I saw. That was prior to Chat GPT being released. When Chat GPT came out, then I kind of turned my focus to language models to some degree. Then I saw how it kind of like attempted to write code, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. It's really not very good. And then things changed on the coding sphere because of how you can do RL and how you can do verification loops on code and math. That has changed since then. But that was the point at which, when it was the same thing, ChatGPT coming out, specifically GPT-4. So I read the Sparks of AGI paper the day after, or almost within 48 hours of it being released. I read that paper, and things were already kind of hot in the AI space at that point. But that paper, I think, changed everything because that was the one that revealed what GPT-4 was able to do behind the scenes that nobody had seen yet. I think that was kind of the hook for for everything. Like GPT-4's abilities in that paper um, changed my perception of what I thought AI could possibly be. Before that, it was toys. That GPT-4 Sparks of AGI paper was it. It's actually probably, I think it's the first article on my blog. It's like, this is the spark.
Wow. Yeah, I think, I mean, I remember playing with, was it GPT-3o, which was the first chat completion model. I think beforehand it was just a standard completions model.
Now, GPT-2 was open source and did some random language type of stuff, but it was nothing that could be in any way commercialized. But 3 got
Yeah, I
closer,
think
and then 3.5 is what we saw, what most people saw.
yeah, 4 was the first one that could reliably generate snippets of code.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, 4 was worlds different than 3.5. Worlds different than 3.5. That was the big turn that everybody's kind of, I think since then people have been hoping that there would be like significant, like similar factors of difference between what was at the time and still is, if you look back, the difference between 3.5 and 4 was
Mhm.
just not, it's not the same game even. So 4 is what made several of the AI stalwarts say, hey, let's stop training anything smarter than GPT-4 for 6 months. I don't know if you remember that paper, or that petition, but that petition came out directly as soon as the Sparks of AGI paper came out because of its reasoning ability.
In retrospect, that might have been a little bit too optimistic. So it turns out
Well,
that
I mean,
getting
if you
to
look back, they
80%
actually
is easy.
they actually didn't do much better than GPT-4 in that 6 months after that.
Yeah. I mean, anybody who's programmed or have done any sort of project, you know that getting 80% of the way there is usually pretty easy, pretty quick. But the last 20%, and especially the last 5%, is a real pain. So, yeah. What's really good about LangGraph and all this orchestration is that you get to take your problem and split it up into steps, and you can feed it into LLMs. You can give it access to tools. You can make things easier and really evaluate how it's doing with one particular task instead of one-shotting it like we did when they first came out, because we thought that they could just handle anything, that they can really organize their thoughts. So LangGraph helps a lot. Other orchestrators help a lot in making those problems easier for the LLMs. Now, when it comes to tools, we've gotten MCP, I think, that's not that old. It's less, maybe a year old, coming out. Could you tell me more about that?
Sure. So LangGraph is kind of like the go-to framework that a lot of enterprises are using to do their proof of concepts internally these days. It has a lot of fighters. It has all the primitives that a developer would need to construct a production-ready flow with AI. It's a great tool set, but it's not production-ready just by downloading the open source LangGraph tool set, right? It doesn't work that way. So the tool set around it that I think that I'm working towards is Anthropic based, Claude code skills based, and subagent based. Skills got released about a couple months ago, very recently. And very quickly, it's become an open standard. Just last week, it was launched on agentskills.io. Anthropic, Cursor, OpenAI, Microsoft. You can see all the vendors on the list on their site, but it is now an open standard. I think it's important because if you look at my contributions to the Austin LangChain from way back, I started this thing called a context or a context file. This is before agents.md existed. Now, most repos, if you're using agentic coding, have an agents.md at the root. That's how it starts. That's how you initiate and define a repository for the agent. So that's the beginning of the context journey for Anthropic. That is the very core file that you start with, whether it's an agents.md or a claude.md. So Claude Code uses claude.md. The industry is kind of glomming around agents.md construct. Skills takes that construct and just makes it a superpower by defining a very, very simple construct that's a zip file. It's basically a folder. A skill is just a folder with a particular set of files in it. The only requirement is that it has to have a skills.md file at the root of the folder. That's literally the only requirement. Outside of that, it has a construct for how to arrange a set of context to be progressively discoverable by the AI agent. So let's say I'm an AI agent. I opened up claude.md and agents.md. I don't know anything about this repo. I see that I have some skills and it says you need to do this task. Skills work by initially injecting a use blah blah skill for these types of procedures. That's literally all it puts in. It puts in like just a few tokens, unlike MCP. MCP puts in like tons of tokens worth of tool instructions and formatting and parameters. So people have gotten away from loading in all of their MCPs. This is why skills is taking off, because people, I think, were pretty frustrated with how many tokens MCPs were taking. And a lot of what's in MCPs should be some sort of domain knowledge, but they're two different concerns. MCP is for external data. Skills is for domain knowledge and practices and specific knowledge about something, anything. So the work that I'm doing right now is trying to figure out how to compartmentalize those properly, because if you look at a world where there's all these skills and they're all folders and they all have very specific domains, let's say a skill for deploying something to Vercel, let's say, just as an example, you can get an off-the-shelf open source skill that is basically just a zip file. It's a static set of assets that can that all it injects at the beginning of the agent prompt, whether it's Claude Code or something else, is use this skill when you need to do X, Y, and Z. And you give it permissions to use that skill. And then within it, it has basically the cheat sheet and user guide as the skills.md for that domain. And then within it, you can have as many references as you want. All those references are just available to the agent rather than being injected into the context window. They're just a defined set of available domain knowledge. And so with that construct, you can construct, you can have sets of skills that are for your own workflow, let's say, that are in one repository, and some skills that are in just a public repository that you get from your vendors. Like you want to, for integration purposes, like you want to keep up with the latest way to deploy to Vercel, right? That changes over time. You can subscribe to a marketplace that updates your skill for that.
Okay.
So something that
So
didn't exist is these marketplaces. Now, marketplaces in Cloud Code are not actually a construct that is an open standard now. Only the skills are, which are like a subset of Claude. So that's why I'm excited about the open standard of the skills, but also practically for enterprises, Anthropic has the tool set and is thinking about context more than anyone else, which is why I lean into Anthropic's tool set for this. And the other reason is that all these context things break down when you're not using the same tool set. So if your team is using GitHub Actions, or they're using Codex or another, Crush or Open Code, regardless of which one of these things they're using, if the team isn't using the same one, they all do these context juggling very differently. Skills is the very first thing the industry has agreed upon that can encapsulates domain knowledge into something really simple and portable, and something that you can link to in a GitHub repo that can update. So there's some problems with that I pointed out, I think, to the awesome LangChain community yesterday, which is in prompt injection. The skills are basically prompts. So if you open up a GitHub repo and you're auto updating your skills all the time, then that's a vector of attack. But these are the types of problems that AI engineers have to deal with right now, is taking the things that can work really, really well, applying them to these workflows, getting acceleration and velocity higher for the teams, but with some practicality of, yeah, but if somebody puts a website that says this on it and your Cloud Code hits it, it could do this. So sandbox it, put it into this container. There's a lot of other things. That's where AWS Agent Core comes in at this point for me, whereas there's a lot of that they take off my plate, which is the whole infrastructure underneath it. Runtime for LangGraph runs in the cloud. You can turn on guardrails. It has an abstraction for gateways in AWS, which had already existed, but now every gateway in AWS is an MCP server. And you can control the access to the MCP external data through IAM directly in Agent Core. So you can actually control different tools within the MCP servers, all programmatically defined in cloud, Terraform, etc. What I'm building is a set of skills that understands all these concepts. It understands the LangGraph concepts, how checkpointing works there, and how to integrate that to AWS Agent Core memory systems. Agent Core has two memory systems. It's got the session checkpoint memory system, and it's got a long-term memory. So you can actually do a graph-based RAG lookup per user, personalize it. So it actually has the user separation and kind of security aspect of that built in as well. Of course, it's AWS, you get some level of vendor lock-in, but I haven't seen any other players with the entire suite for taking something that folks like us that are working in the Austin LangChain community and like working with prototypes and like, hey, I got this working. And you can see that it does the work, that it addresses the use case, but how do you put it into production? You're seeing everything. I'm like Dan saying, oh, the last mile, getting into production is the hardest part. Yeah, absolutely true. But there are ways to get into production. It's just more costly, and people have to understand that it's never going to be 100%. They have to hit the use cases that fit in that.
Okay. So that's interesting. They have their gateways also set up as MCP servers.
They have the other primitives too. So they have containers, so you can run code execution per agent. So each agent that you put in Agent Core can have its own little container that it can execute code in. That's a primitive in Agent Core. Browsers to browse are a primitive. Policies are a primitive. Memory is a primitive. So all those primitives are hooked in, and observability is a primitive that hooks directly into CloudWatch. I got the AWS AI practitioner certification a couple weeks ago, I think you saw. And there's a whole breadth of stuff that they have in SageMaker, in Bedrock, and the suite around them. This Agent Core thing is new. It wasn't covered in that certification. It's too new, actually. But everything in that suite of tools seems to be incorporated really well into Agent Core, where you can leverage the AWS primitives directly in the LangGraph world. Like the checkpoints are automatically linked to the short-term memory in AWS Agent Core. So you don't have to do anything else other than what you've already done in LangGraph.
All right. So skills to me sound like they're very much curated prompt, they're curated prompt templates, I guess. They're sort of like the name of the game ever since these models came out, it turned out was context. But we don't really control the tuning that much except as a last resort. But for the most part, it seems to be how do you present context in a way that is most useful and reduces hallucinations, gets you to your goal without any of the side effects. And originally, that was just coming up with better and better prompts, storing those as templates, and then we later moved on to doing semantic search. Similarity kind of deals with vector databases. We still use those, obviously, and we still use prompt templates. And then we
It's all
needed a
around the
better
tool
way.
calling paradigm. It's all around the tool
Yeah,
calling paradigm. Because like as soon as tool
yeah.
calling came out, that's when things were like, okay, now that we can call tools, how do we call tools? Which tools do we call? And then therein lies the question of like, how do you transform a world that has tools for humans into good tools for AI?
And it turns out that these AIs are actually much more prone to being distracted than humans are. So it seems like with MCP, we have too many options for it to go. And then skills is sort of what we did previously with restricting context into these specific domains. And it sounds like these skills are curated. Are they like human curated, because like even vector search is like the cornerstone of RAG. Even graph RAG, it still uses vector search, just searches on nodes rather than on large sentences. And so it seems as if like that's the fundamental strategy right now. It seems to be repeated in every single task, every single level of interaction with the LLM. We have LangGraph now so that we can split up our prompting to the agent. We have graph RAG so we can split up the vector search for RAG. And now it seems as if skills is sort of splitting up the tool calling in a way. So is that correct, or did I miss something?
Well, skills is just an additive across the entire ecosystem um, because at each one of those points, you can actually call the API. When you call the Anthropic API right now, skills are actually supported in the Anthropic ecosystem directly in the API, which means that you can give the skill to any API call. There's a new call where you can upload your skill because it's a static set of files like the skills.md and the artifact, it's references, assets, and scripts directories are the main ones that you have in the top level. But you can just upload that directly in the API, and within the API calls, it will go and traverse and use your skill. So
Okay.
they've put it into the entire ecosystem. It's not necessarily just at a certain layer. Now that's how they've done it in their API. That's not to say that's how Cursor will do their things. There's a whole bunch of people. It's an open standard now. I guess it's interesting if Cursor is implementing skills directly into Cursor and then they call the API, would they upload the skill or reference it? I don't know, but this is the new world we're in. This is technology that's like 3 months old. And what I do is I follow all the changes to the specification in the docs in Git, basically. Because since they've
Yeah.
released it every day, they've tweaked the documentation like, oh, this is actually required here in this field in the plugin system. So it's literally forming underneath us as we go. Part of my current pattern with this, though, just to kind of answer your question, I think, is how do you wrap it up in all these pieces? Is I currently am of the mind that pretty much every repository that I'm creating requires its own plugin construct. That gives you the entire breadth of Claude Code skill toolset within each repo. And so I've actually got a repository domain expert pattern that I've started. So every repository that I have has an expert, subagents, and some skills, and they know how to work together. So when I'm going to Claude Code, every time I see it make a mistake when it's doing again, using the deployment to Vercel example, it's like, oh, I tried to do this. Oh, that call was wrong. I didn't get that right. I'm like, well, add that to your skill. So that loop I haven't perfected yet, but I've basically been building these skills and subagents so that as they do their work and turn their reports in the flow that Anthropic has designed, that they add a little note at the end on how to improve themselves. So this is the self-improvement AI thing in practice within Claude Code, within subagents, basically. So I'm writing some benchmarks to eval my skills across a set of projects, and I've asked the LangChain community for some LangGraph examples to do the skills application for an agent core deployment of LangGraph. So if you got a couple of ones that you want to try or know someone else, I'm looking for some guinea pigs to use the skills to then deploy something that I haven't seen before into agent core with these skills. That's what I'm working with the marketplace for agent insights that I'll be launching hopefully soon once I can validate that I can do these things. I've already got some of it working myself for my own first test, but it needs more proving out.
Wow. Okay. I'll have to think about a few skills that I need to be produced. I think I'm trying to view this conceptually. So skills, they're like a hierarchical set of prompts that call each other? Like we discussed that at the top level, there's a skill inside this directory, but like how,
Yeah.
once you get in that directory, what's going on?
So once you get into that directory, there's a skills.md. And within there, there's some prescriptive set of subdirectories. One is references. That's the main one. So references is in that subdirectory in a skill, you should find a set of documentation, basically. That's where the documentation of the skill goes. There's another subfolder called assets, and that's where you put templates. So if the skill is going to be doing something often and often needs to use the same order form, let's say, well, you put a template of the order form in the skill so that the domain knowledge is complete. So it knows how to operate on an order form, and it knows what an order form looks like. Here's an example. And it knows where to go to get it because it's in this progressive, discoverable layout. And the progressive means what the language model ingests first. So the first thing it ingests is skills.md. It's like, okay, I'm looking at skills.md. I know I'm in a skill because I've been prompted about that before. So I kind of know that there's supposed to be a references directory, assets directory, etc. Right? So skills.md starts describing how to deal with a Vercel deployment. Do you have a key for Vercel available in the environment? That's the first thing you want to check. Well, there's a bunch of ways to check that, right? Is there a script in the skill that will help me do that? If there is, skills.md should point that out and make it so that my language model doesn't have to guess how to find that key at all. Because I've seen it do that before, and I've just added that as a domain knowledge to my skill. So it's basically preventing all the things. It's constant context engineering to get improvement. You see where it skips and messes up, and you build a better form around it.
So to differentiate that from just simple prompts, that seems to be like a prompt is more like becoming a more skilled manager to try to communicate to your employee, whereas these skills appear to be a standard operating procedure that you're going to produce around a particular task that you're going to do repetitively. And then whenever you discover that it's been done incorrectly, you go back, revise your standard operating procedure.
Well, that's where you get into a little bit of the, what's missing out of this, right? What's missing out of the skills is when you said standard operating procedure, the operator is missing. So Anthropic and Claude Code have a construct for that. LangGraph also has a construct for that called subagents, right? But subagents are not an open standard right now. So everybody's doing their own subagents. And it's basically a subloop that has its own context window is how Claude Code defines a subagent. LangGraph, I think, defines a subagent a little differently. So there's no agreed upon operator. So yes, the skill is kind of your SOP, but that kind of lends itself to who's operating and where the operating instructions go. Though in a company that has already bet on Anthropic and are all in and the whole team's using it, you could use a subagent and define it, like have that be the operator and have a team define that operator. Skills doesn't quite get you there. Skills is like a book. So it is the SOP, but you're handing it over to the operator. Who's the operator? Well, it's not standardized yet. The whole flow of what to do and who's doing it, how it's being done is still kind of gray for what the skill is. So still kind of have to design the skill so it can be useful for both scenarios, unless you're going to be in an Anthropic only ecosystem, in which case, in my case, and that's how I design things for my customers that are already decided on Anthropic, to then go all in and design a skill and a subagent together. That's really powerful because then you can start separating out the operations into a set of actual steps that can be taken in the operational guide, which would be in a subagent abstraction, not in a skill abstraction. They'd work together.
Interesting. Yes. So that's very there's this book that's called like the Checklist Manifesto. It's about how checklists made their way out of engineering, and then in the early 2000s, they finally started using them in medicine. And so when they do use them inside a surgical suite, there is, I believe, one nurse whose sole job is to make sure that the operating staff are following the checklist. So in the case of Anthropic with subagents, it seems like you have a
It's
orchestrator
called the circulating
type.
nurse.
Well, it's purely by coincidence. So, and in this case, you have a circulating nurse, head agent that has a whole bunch of subagents that it is making sure checks off each of the tasks while it compares those tasks and the completion of those to your skills.
Yeah, but none of the stuff in the prompting space is an end state. So in that subagent, I try to give it this meta knowledge of, hey, you're also improving yourself, because I've seen these subagents, you can send them off and they'll make the same mistakes and they'll correct them, but they'll be in a different context window, so you won't see them. If they don't report back how they can improve, then you're kind of wasting tokens and you're losing observability to some degree. So it's all a balance in the context space. But then you get to the point of when you get a use case that you can measure on, you have a whole suite of things like the Claude Code SDK, which will allow you to automate this stuff. So I could be running all these things headless completely, as is with skills and subagents, etc., to then compare one versus the other for actual production releases.
Thank you for the introduction to skills. This is something brand new I just learned here live on stream. So,
Of course.
Is there any place that people can find you? Do
Yeah,
you have a LinkedIn or Twitter?
agentinsights.com is my company. I've got LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm just Vaskin on LinkedIn, Vaskin K on Twitter.
Right, well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for meeting me.
Thanks.
Christmas discussion about Cloud Code, AWS, and everything.
Appreciate it.